Thank you, Steve. And as mentioned, our speaker today is not a newcomer as a presenter. In January and May of last year, 2021, Bob Martin helped us get a handle on what was going on with COVID-19. And he's back again for a follow-up. As background, Bob got his undergraduate degree at Brown and his master's and PhD at MIT. He is a retired chief technology officer at Bell Labs. And although he lists his permanent address on Long Beach Island, he's coming to us this morning from across the country, perhaps looking out at the Pacific this morning. And so I would like to say also that I'm hoping that the title of today's presentation, which is COVID-19 2 years into the pandemic, might be the last time we'll hear it referred to that way. As we're aware, the governor of New Jersey declared yesterday the end of the pandemic. We are now in the endemic stage of dealing with COVID-19, and I'm sure Bob's going to bring us up to date on all the research he's been doing since he last presented at the Old Guard. And having said that, it's over to you, Bob.
Great, thank you for the gracious introduction. Yesterday, we were walking by the Pacific and got fresh fish, which we cooked last night. Let me share a screen. Here we go. Okay, so we see the same old mouse, somewhat subdued, though the vaccine needle is a bit disrupted. You see my mascot, the COVID Groundhog Day, still worrying about world disruptions. He's a bit worn out. Okay, what we're going to cover today is a little bit about the pandemic, Omicron, the virus, disease, you can see the rest. The message in the overview is that these rolling in, then Delta and Omicron crushed our hopes for the early end, and the virus is here to stay. Okay, this is the pre-Omicron view. Twice we hoped the darn thing was over. Last June, even though we had some variants, which you see shown here going around the world and seasonality, it really looked like it was over. The summer was great. And then Delta hit and, up it went. But then it started to go down towards the end of the year. And we thought, by gosh, 2022 is going to be better. Now we had COVID fatigue and bad behavior, which I'll talk a lot about later. But we had great antivirals and vaccines. So things were looking darn good. With Delta, the flu, SARS-2 was here to stay. Now, one important context is 75% of the seasonal flu cases are caused by descendants of the Spanish flu. So that it's here to stay really isn't new. Now, some viruses can be eradicated. Smallpox, with its big death rate, 30%, was eradicated after a 13-year World Health Organization campaign. And by the way, polio, measles, mumps, rubella could also be eradicated. But beta coronaviruses, this is a family of them, including SARS-2, MERS, SARS, cannot be. They're carried in animals. And they've been carried in all the animals that you see below, including, importantly, a third estimated of the 30 million US white-tailed deer from whom a human has been infected. So this thing is here to stay. Well, what if we had great vaccines? Couldn't we get it under control that way? Couldn't we eliminate it? Different than eradicate, eliminate means it's under control. We talked about herd immunity. That's where everybody is safe enough, the thing doesn't spread. Even with 100% effective vaccine, that is, nobody gets infected, this is how many people would have to be vaccinated. It just isn't going to happen. That vaccination rate has not happened any place in the world, certainly not the United States, and no vaccine is 100% effective. Okay, let's talk about Omicron. Okay, this is the pre-Omicron US case rates. It's really that earlier chart. Now for the US with more detail. You see daily case rates as the axis, and you see them going up and kind of bumpy. And they go up and down by behavior, seasonality, different variants. A very important point, when Omicron hit, 84% of the people in the United States were previously infected and or vaccinated. We had lots of immunity. Now, what causes that uptick? Why do things go up? Well, it's two things. One, how many people an individual could quickly infect? That's this R naught, which I'll describe a little bit more in detail later, that we talked about before. The serial interval, how quickly can a person get infected and how long they're infectious. And how many people could be infected. Say everybody's vaccinated, fewer people could be infected. So the transmission rate would go down. And this is roughly what the curve looked like. The left axis is the ability to evade previous protection. The bottom axis is this R naught and the shorter serial interval. I left off the infectious period, which is not as important and doesn't change that much. And the red line is the transmission rate. How quickly is it going up? And in each case, for a variant to replace its previous one, it has to have a higher transmission rate. I'll let you guess why there's a lot of space on the right on that curve. Now, let's talk about this ability to escape, also called neutralization escape. And say I had data on how well the blood from patient D1 could escape Omicron, and we'll call that ND10. Don't worry, I'm not going to go too much further than that. Now, there was a fascinating paper that showed how Omicron avoids previous infection protection. Think of the matrix above as a map of cities and distance between cities. All the chart is a map of the distance between the neutralization of somebody's blood and blood that has that particular variant. So in this case, patient D1 is that far away from neutralizing Omicron, with each square being a factor of 2. So it's kind of a nice little chart that shows how good is blood, previous infection, good in neutralizing. The main message to pull from this chart is Omicron is in a very different space. Some people have argued it should be a different type of virus, even called a serotype. Let's go back to this R naught. R naught is the number of people that a person on average can affect. So in this little curve, it's just 2. The bottom person can infect 2 right above, and the next one can infect 2. And the serial interval is the distance, is the time between subsequent infections. Pretty easy. Now, the fascinating thing is if you look at the new cases on the nth day, not the total, the new, in an entirely unconstrained population, that is, everybody could be infected all the time, which isn't the case, then you have this exponential growth. And if it was fully unconstrained, Omicron could infect 1 billion times as many people as the original virus on the 30th day. So basically what's happened, because of the drop of the neutralization ability, shown with this red arrow on the left, and the increased R0 and shorter serial interval, the transmission rate just skyrocketed. So this is what happened. I took the previous chart and added Omicron. I had to squeeze it a lot because of the huge Omicron rate. In the US, the peak was 3 times our old rate, and it went up and down very quickly. From peak to peak, 46 days as compared to the 125 days on the other previous peak. The trough, however, is still quite a bit higher than our Jersey trough. I'm not as optimistic as the governor on this. We'll get back to that. I'm very optimistic about the summer, not right now. Now, how did Omicron do it? All kinds of tricks. It really is good at infecting where we sneeze. That's why it spreads so much. Lots of super spreaders, reinfects people, breaks through vaccinations. So it is really tricky. Here's a horrible thought. What if Omicron was the first virus? We would have had 2 to 4 million deaths in 2 months, unless we'd had a big lockdown. The previous 2-month peak was 180,000 deaths. So without a lockdown, a really strenuous one, there would have been societal collapse. We were really lucky. However, people talk about it being less severe. It is still very deadly. And I'm really annoyed at all the headlines. It's not deadly. Look at the relative death rates of Omicron versus Delta, the one we talked about being so terrible. The daily death rates are higher. And as a matter of fact, they're still 5.5 times higher, national average, than the last summer peak. Jersey's numbers are about 70% of these, by the way. So even though one's chance of being hospitalized are a third less than Delta, January was the first time that COVID was the US leading cause of death. And as compared to Delta, Omicron has roughly the same unvaccinated death rate, 1.6 the peak hospitalization rate, 4 times the 0 to 4-year-old hospitalization rates. And because we're so lousy on vaccines, we have double the death rate than Europe. So, very important message. It's still deadly. Don't let this less severe fool you. Okay, let's talk about the virus. First, it's astoundingly well understood and tracked. Don't know where it came from. Its properties are well understood, and it has important sublineages. Okay, we talked about this before. A mutation is just a change in one of the virus's base pairs. They happen at the rate a month. They speed up in leading to a variant of concern. The mutation rate goes up by a factor of 4. All kinds of causes, which we'll get to later. Variants are just a collection of mutations. They have sublineages. These are the ones the World Health Organization is monitoring. The ones we hear most about are the variants of concern. You see them there. There are also variants of interest when they're worried about monitoring. Well, let's pay attention, and ones that they're not paying attention to anymore. Importantly, they don't monitor thousands of them. You get an idea of how variance prevalence change. This is the US data. Two messages from it. There's a lot of data being gathered to understand this chart. US is number one in this now. Biden changed that. And so what you see here in the color is Delta, came in roughly in April and stayed until roughly December when Omicron quickly pushed it out. A typical viral evolution path by a wonderful talk by a great researcher, Jesse Bloom, pointed out, looks like a ladder that the subsequently each succession set of variants wipe out the previous one, and it goes in a ladder. One follows the other, follows the other, follows the other. That is not what SARS has done. SARS just pops up all over the place. Wuhan, where the first one came out, might have been two. Paper came out just this week that postulated there were actually two different transmissions from animals, A and B. But anyway, it kind of looked ladder-like. You see the variants of concern. If you blow this up, it doesn't. And then out of the blue came Omicron. First guess was that an HIV patient, which is a great mutation breeding machine, a rat or a mouse, or the Merck pill, caused the Omicron various strains. You see them there. I'm going to describe them more later. And nobody knew. And then another guess came out that it was a recombination of a successor to Gamma and Wuhan. People don't know where it came from. So it's a big mystery. One of the astounding things to me is within a month, there was this picture from the chirogenic microscope, measures the distance between two hydrogen atoms on a water molecule, had a picture of the spike protein and all the mutations, 1 month. Moreover, now shown in color on each of the mutations, people knew exactly which mutation increased the ability to infect by various means or to evade various antibodies or vaccines. So 1 month. Omicron has sublineages with the names BA1, BA1.1, BA2, BA3. They share some of the spike mutations and have different ones. So they're really different beasts. BA1.1 with just one more mutation is slightly more immune evasive than the one that first hit us and slightly more transmittable. However, BA2 is a very different beast. It behaves differently. It is much more transmissible, slightly more neutralization escape, and reinfections have happened both ways, but they're mild. Good news is BA2 responds the same way to vaccines. BA3 is rare and little is known about it. And Omicron and Delta co-infections have occurred. That is, people have been infected by both at the same time. Don't feel good about them. Okay, the disease, two things. The impact on our bodies is just grim, but astoundingly well understood And long COVID is a mystery, but will be the pandemic's lasting wake. I'm not going to go through all the details on this. We have gone through before how the disease progresses, but I thought you'd be interested in seeing how much is now understood and what that understandings are for the implications of long COVID. When we last got together, or 2 times ago, we got together and we reviewed again in May. We said the way that the virus starts to spread is the innate immune system underreacts, which allows explosive replication to where we get billions of copies. As this is doing this, by the way, the clinical progression is different with Omicron than Delta. So your odds of a sore throat are a factor of 2 higher than Delta, and the odds of loss of sense and smell are about a factor of 5 less. I've helped several people who have had Omicron infections, all had terrible sore throats. In this early phase, genes start to get dysregulated. About 40% of our genes, 40% regulation change, where we either generate more or fewer proteins, and that dysregulation changes as the disease advances. As this happens, our regulatory system that controls our blood pressure and some of our inflammatory response fails. That then leads to the innate immune system overreaction. That's the cytokine storm and the bradykine storm we talked about, which lead to the hyperinflammation and blood clots. All these things together lead to cell damage or death. Autoantibodies, those are our antibodies that attack our cells, and disrupted molecular processes. A paper came out that identified 43 different important molecular processes that get screwed up by COVID infection. Here are some just listed. I'm not going to go through the list. Lots of recent studies, however, that we have less gray matter. All that together leads to damage or failed organs. Kind of everything goes, anything you can think of, and that leads to death and long COVID. Each of those items have at least 1 or 2 papers that I've read that describes the horrible impact. If the public health officials had publicized one of them, the pandemic might have been sooner behind us. And this paper would have convinced the anti-maskers to run to the mask store. Title was Mask Up to Keep It Up. Preliminary evidence of the association between erectile dysfunction and COVID. I bet if this had been in the South, mask wearing would have gone up. Okay, long COVID. This is a thing I worry about as much as COVID, by the way. It's a post-viral debilitating illness. It isn't new, happened with the Russian flu, now suspected to be a coronavirus rather than a flu virus, the Spanish flu, and the seasonal flu. That's where people think chronic fatigue syndrome might come from. Bring out the standard suspects, inflammation, these processes, autoantibodies, virus hangs around, huge damage, the organs and the processes already described, great impacts on quality of life, lots of depression. 1 million people in the US are disabled from long COVID now. Mortality risk increases 1 year after COVID. That means if you've had COVID, your chance of dying in the next year just went up. If you're 30 years old, your chance of dying in the next year went up close to a factor of 3.5. Now, prevalence is unknown. Assessment is by surveys, and inherent selection bias. You ask everybody, do you want to participate? Well, the people who have long COVID, they want to participate. Since there's no long COVID blood tests, symptoms are often assessed by subjective self-analysis. How many of you guys have felt fatigue or had brain fog in the last couple of months? I'd sure be on the list. Here is a scatter chart where the left axis is a percent of people reported to have long COVID. The bottom axis is the days after the infection had been cleared when the survey was run. The dots are all over the place. Now, I have a guess, having read maybe 130, 135 papers on long COVID, what the prevalence is, but it's a guess. No good data on asymptomatic. If you're unvaccinated and just symptomatic, it looks like about 15%. If you've been in the ICU, about 60%. If you're vaccinated, rate looks like it drops by a factor of 2, with mRNA dropping it a bit more. Sad part, there aren't treatments. Post-vaccination has helped some. I am very pessimistic that broad treatments will be found. Too many parts of the body have been screwed up. Okay, how people behaved, as you know, disrupted our daily lives. Lots of stress, very different outcomes based on personal belief. Omicron's economic impact was minor. I've shown this chart a couple of times. By now, that's how we feel. Man, we're just worn out. Of course, we've talked a lot about the impact of the virtual world on how we work, shop, and entertain. I think a bunch of it's going to be permanent. The cities are in trouble. You see it in housing price explosion and small businesses in cities. Violence, because of stress, has just gone up. You see gun permits have skyrocketed, murders went up, the numbers of 12 to 17-year-olds killed or injured went up, mass shootings have gone up. Stress, we all feel it. It's had some very sad consequences. Alzheimer's patients, not counting those who die because of COVID, but after, just because of loneliness, their death rates went up. Depression up 50%, insomnia doubled, drug overdose doubled, airplane rage, which we've all read about, doubled. We're all feeling stress. Postponed health care led to increased cancer rates, more home births, fewer surgeries, vaccinations down, children's BMI increase rate doubled, and about 5 million children were orphaned. A terrible aftermath. Behaviors and outcome differed by partisan affiliation, socioeconomic status, and religious beliefs. Everything changed. Disease frequency, death rate, vaccination rate, how we behaved, whether we were employed, whether we made or lost money. Our behavior has been terrible. You see here the full vaccination rates. We're the lowest of developed countries, and our death rate is the highest. What a paradox. We had the best vaccines. There's no question the mRNA vaccines are the best in the world. I'll get to that. Partisan affiliation was the strongest predictor of vaccination, masking, and social distancing rate. The patchwork of uneven state-controlled public health policies didn't help. And of course, personal beliefs made a big difference. I'm free to act. I guess I'm free to drive drunk. I'm invincible. I don't trust anybody. And this is the tragedy. This is a terrible tragedy. If you look at the death rate of the 1/10 of the counties in the country that most heavily voted for Trump, that's the red line. The blue line is the 10th of the countries that most heavily voted for Biden. Look at that ratio. It is just terrible. It hit our Ocean County, which Trump won by 30%. Very low vaccination rate. It has a worse death rate than Mississippi. And in the developed countries, only Peru had a worse death rate. So this partisan behavior is just a tragedy. Okay, what about our new world? Okay, I mentioned before, but this is what motivates me. It takes 100 viral particles to get infected, and there are 200 million in a sneeze. Wearing the right mask makes a big deal. Any of you guys who read my updates see every time I say wear an N95 mask. You see 3 kinds of masks. They all have nose clips. Most surgical masks don't. So this is optimistic on how well surgical masks are. And you see the relative protection if the susceptible person, the column, and the infected person, the rows, wear the different masks. So if I wear an N95 mask, I have 7 times the protection. Excuse me. If I wear an N95 mask and the other guy wears a surgical mask, I have 74 times protection. So it's a big deal. When we travel, Ann and I wear these N95 masks and goggles. We rotate our masks one every 5 days. You know, the infectious particles are on the outside. Cholera led to clean water, biggest reduction in death rate, by the way, of anything. COVID-19 might lead to clean air. We have medical grade air purifiers and ultraviolet light in our HVAC. But then you have to figure out, how do you behave? On February 25th, the CDC came out with new mask guidance. And they said for Santa Barbara County, where I am right now, they said it was medium risk assessment. Ocean County was low. Well, I'm very skeptical about the CDC. So I looked at other measures. I looked at their county case rate. They report 7-day new cases. They said the transmission risk in Santa Barbara County was high, and in Ocean County was substantial. I looked at COVID Act Now, New York Times, they count different things. Very high risk in Santa Barbara County, and in Ocean County, medium risk and very high risk. State in New Jersey reports daily averages. Santa Barbara County reports different kinds of case counts. USA Facts doesn't normalize. Yeah, how do you make sense out of this mess? So, exasperated, I wrote a back of the envelope model to determine the maximum case rates based on how many times we might go to indoor restaurants based on our risk tolerance. Decided to heck with all this, try to figure out what we wanted to do and look at our risk tolerance and come up with the case rates. Economic impacts. Of course, they're the big ones we've been reading about, the disruptions from reduced labor supply and record quitting rates, all kinds of reasons for the quitting rates, retirements, deaths, disabled, caregivers staying at home, people afraid to go to work, supply chain. All of this led to inflation, which, of course, with horrible Russian action has gotten worse. Record was set on the percentage of employed people on sick leave with Omicron. There were only market jitters, minor market jitters, when Omicron hit. This is the cumulative change in the S&P in late 2021. It's kind of fun to see what happened as news came out, designated a variant of concern, dropped like a rock. Well, maybe not so bad. Oops, I'm not sure a vaccine will work. Well, came to the US. This is looking like late February 2020. And BioNTech's vaccine said they will work. Well, might need a new vaccine. Hey, we can have it in 100 days. Appears less severe. Viral says boosted should work. Good Jobs report, a new S&P record. So it's just minor, but it certainly was nerve-wracking as we all went through it. Okay, politics and national responses. First things, politics, every place in the world led the national responses. No public health agency led the national response. Their choices resulted in dramatically different outcomes. What mattered was being decisive, having your decisions based on science, having a population that paid attention to you, and have money to work your way through the tough times. Let's look at three countries: United States, South Korea, and Australia. First, the outcomes. These were, as of November 20th, 20. The reason I picked that date is I did a very detailed study of about 34 countries, and I wanted to do it before the variants in vaccines, which would screw up the response analysis. Okay, these is the death rate as of 11/20, 701 in the United States, 9 in South Korea, 36 in Australia. You see the GDP drops, US number one again. Unemployment peak, we're number one again. Australia had the peak GDP. Let's unravel that mystery. Okay, what actions did the countries take? We didn't do anything until a month after SARS-CoV-2 was declared a pandemic. And then we had the state-controlled and partisan bias plans. No testing until mid-March, a major CDC botch. Contract tracing never worked in the US, too many cases, and we never had a national app, and we had late CDC guidance on masks. They were unevenly worn. The big action in South Korea is they acted quickly, they had tests immediately, and their whole strategy was based on testing every suspected case, tracing and quarantining all potential cases. They never had a lockdown, they never closed their border, heavy mask use. Australia acted late. They had lots of tests, but because they acted late, they had heavy use of lockdowns, that's the big GDP, and they closed their border. Mask was only moderate. Let's go forward a little bit. This is vaccination, 2 doses and booster. Pay attention particularly to the booster. In the US, South Korea, and Australia, again, we're last. These were the Omicron peak and death rates. Everybody had a big peak. I mean, this thing is transmissible. But again, look at the difference in the death rates. It has to do with the booster. If you look at the total pandemic deaths, it's very sad to look at the ratio of ours to South Korea or Australia. And the message is that our death rate would have been less than the average flu's annual death rate, which would have been 220 per million over 2 years, with strong science-based leadership, adherent behavior, and reasonable vaccine booster rates. This thing need not have been a pandemic. Okay, vaccines. This is the pre-Omicron vaccine effectiveness. This is CDC data. What you have to do is multiply the two numbers. So you get a factor of 5 for not getting infected, and you get another factor of 5 if you are infected on your total risk of dying. One of the things that another thing that really annoys me about the CDC is their lack of good, detailed data. They don't have, did the person die based on what kind of vaccine? Had they previously been infected? As a function of age, they don't do it. The best data is from Israel, Qatar, and the United Kingdom. They're the ones I go to for most of my studies. A booster really popped the effectiveness. Compare the first overlay to the second. Safety, annoying short-term side effects like fatigue. There are serious vaccine-dependent side effects, but they're rare: blood clots, heart problems. All of them are significantly more frequent with COVID. If you look at the benefit to just the Pfizer vaccine, last year, about 110,000 lives saved, 700,000 hospitalizations, about $70 billion in savings. So huge benefits. If you counted all the vaccines and the total amount of time, of course, these numbers skyrocket. The problem, however, that came up last year is we found out that the vaccines wane. By the way, all vaccines wane. It's called the $1 trillion problem because there are lots of $1 million prizes. People don't know why they wane. They popped up with the booster, and as we'll see, they went back down. People are working on next generation vaccines that might wipe this puppy out. They'll go after all the viruses, be mutation resistant. We'll take it nasally to protect the upper respiratory system. They might be combined for better antibody and T cell response. Talk about that, more about that later. And they're going to go after bunches of places, on the virus, belts and suspenders. Now let's look at Omicron vaccination. This is UK data. This chart shows the effectiveness against catching. So it's not against severity, just whether you get it. And you see in green Delta and in red Omicron, look how much it wanes, and look that there's basically no protection against infection with Omicron without a booster. If you get a booster, either Pfizer or Moderna, the protection goes up, but it's still really isn't very good. It's still easy to catch this thing. Fortunately, the severity protection is quite good. Again, the UK data, the red Omicron, the green Delta, and now you're getting much better protection, particularly if you had the Moderna booster. Much of the vaccine protection is from T cells rather than antibodies. So AstraZeneca or J&J, followed by one of the mRNA boosters, have similar performance. The boosted effectiveness against death looks to be like 60 times as compared to the unvaccinated. People have got the fourth shot of the original vaccine, small impact on effectiveness, improved severity effectiveness for the 65 plus. That's an Israeli study. Now, Omicron specific boosters are expected late this month or early next. They appear, that's a very important italics, to be effective against Omicron, but not previous variants. Data must come out on this. What is a way to think about why it might be worthwhile waiting for the Omicron booster? This is a version of the chart that I showed before, but now showing the effectiveness of the different vaccines against the various variants. And you see they are quite effective against those that are clustered around Wuhan and not effective against Omicron. The further away something is from one of those little dots, the less effective the serum was from a vaccinated person at neutralizing. So a way to think, this is my chart, this is not a study, a way to think about what a vaccine does is provide a zone of protection around the original variant. So our vaccines zone did a pretty good job around the original one, but didn't reach very far out to Omicron. What we're hoping is that the Omicron zone of protection goes around Omicron. This might be a hint of flu-like annual mixed variant vaccines that the US plans to test. We'll come back to this. US vaccine hesitancy is kind of new, it's unusual. Look at the vaccination rates of 24-month-olds. Measles, mumps, 91%. You see the percentages for the other childhood diseases, all in the 80 to 90%. We tried behavioral nudges, lotteries. They didn't work. Only shoves worked, mandates. This nudge even caused an outrage. Somebody said, Big Bird says kids get vaccines. Some politicians went nuts. Now, I bet you this nudge worked. In Singapore, if you went and played the slot machine, somebody was there to give you a vaccination. So that nudge probably worked. I'm sure this one worked. A brothel in Austria said if you came in for a roll in the hay, they would vaccinate you. So either get screwed or get screwed, take your choice. Now, these were the surprises to me. The astounding rigidity and hardening of views in the face of data on its effectiveness against death and the safety. The sad and growing belligerence, and I'm afraid lasting between the vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. The saddest one is women who are pregnant or planning to get pregnant are very hesitated to get vaccinated in the face of vast, 20 studies at least, unambiguous, compelling data. It's safe for them, their fetuses, their babies, and it's dangerous. COVID is very, very dangerous to them, their fetuses, and their babies. This is the vaccination rate with the light color women planning to get pregnant, vaccinated before, and those who got vaccinated during, only 40%. It's terrible. Vaccinating the world is very difficult. Here are the world vaccination rates, European, South America. You see how low Africa is, particularly a couple of the countries. Production is not the issue. There was plenty of production in 2022 to vaccinate the world. Distribution systems are flawed. This is spoiled AstraZeneca vaccines in Nigeria. These are pictures of why it is so difficult to get them into the arms of all the people in the countries. Demand is the issue now. COVAX, the World Project, had 436 million doses by March, and the developing countries only wanted 100 million by May. Omicron, I think, was a one-year setback. 8.5 billion of the 11 billion doses administered last year are ineffective against Omicron without an mRNA booster. All the Chinese vaccines, I think the Russian, but Russia, of course, doesn't provide data. AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, the only way they're effective is with an mRNA booster. So these were the contracts that had been signed. I X'd out the ones just to give you a visual idea of how many are not effective. Okay, therapeutics. You got to act quickly. You got to pay attention to which ones are now effective but there's a new antiviral that's a pandemic game changer. It took about 11 months to develop the first monoclonal antibody. That's something you infuse and it acts kind of like you've had a vaccine. Not really, but it just gloms onto the virus to make sure it can't enter. Sadly, even though it was available and there were 50 million cases, only 1 million doses. The dose were 93% effective in reducing death. If you're seriously ill, you're in trouble. You're in big trouble. It's true for all the respiratory diseases. All the action has been in the antivirals. Over 80% of the papers I read are in antivirals. What would I do if I had Omicron COVID? One, I'd really act quickly. Got to act within 5 days for them to be effective. If I had to go to a hospital, I'd go to a large, if possible, COVID-dedicated hospital. The actions I would follow are described in a 1.5-page Word document, if anybody wants it, that some friends have used. Monoclonal antibodies are very variant sensitive. The first ones were wiped out by Beta. Almost all of the next ones were wiped out by Omicron. One was left, and it was wiped out by the variant that's taken over. Fortunately, just 6 weeks after Omicron was designated variant of concern, a new monoclonal antibody came up that is effective against all versions. This is the big news. This is the huge news. Pfizer came up with a pill that happens to inhibit the way the virus copies itself. It reduced hospitalization by 89%, and there were no deaths in a 3,000-person trial of unvaccinated people who had at least one comorbidity, old, obese. Doesn't eliminate long COVID. People still get sick. You really got to watch the drug interactions. It's likely mutation resistant based on a study I did. So this thing is huge. In the future, it's going to hopefully look like the vaccines. They're going to be really good, mutation resistant. They might even be able to be designed. Great talk by Andrew Ward, who thought they could be designed, absolutely designed in 3 to 5 years. We might put a bunch together, and more of them are going to do things like this Pfizer antiviral pill, not go after the spike, but another one of the proteins. It's hard. This is a mutation-resistant monoclonal antibody that was developed and was successfully attacked a conserved portion of the spike protein in lab tests against alpha, beta, Company raised $750 million. They were doing so well. And it failed in an Omicron clinical trial. So it's tough. Okay, what's next? We need to prepare for the next pandemic. Trend is probably destiny. These are the novel viruses that have come up over the last 15 years. Will there be another one? Probably will be. World Health Organization gets 4,500 signals a month, but only does studies on 33. World track record in the past on pandemic preparedness is terrible. They haven't done anything, except for China and South Korea, who acted after SARS and MERS. And South Korea's actions were the underpinnings for its response for SARS-CoV-2. Likewise, China's. International plans, the plans so far from the World Health Organization, they're non-enforceable, altruistic. We should all do better. There are 2 focused plans that are pretty good. one in an early warning system, well-funded, 150 million, and one on trying to get vaccines in 100 days, very, very hard. We'll take different guidance on releasing vaccines earlier, but well-funded, about 3 billion. How big a problem is this? Well, there have been more deaths per capita in the US than World War I's and World War II's deaths combined. It's cost more to the US than all the previous wars' inflated costs combined. It's a big deal. Well, what do we spend on national threats? Annually, this is last year, DOD spent $725 billion, $3 billion on research. CDC spends, well, a pittance as compared to that. Really need to add the NIH, but that's very, very small. What's our track record been? We really did a good job after anthrax. It was superb. Bush had a magnificent 2005 preparedness plan. However, it wasn't followed. We felt it in the pandemic. We didn't have a good stockpile. We couldn't manufacture essential equipment or drugs. We had the test system debacle. This is the proposed plan, one that came out in September, 65 billion over 7 to 10 years. So that's 10 billion a year, 7 billion a year, 1/100th of the DOD. That makes sense. And by the way, most of it's focused towards technology. Separate proposals have come out for preparedness and present response that are getting to a couple of the systemic issues: nursing homes, hospital capacity, viral tracking, but it's still a small plan. And in my view, they don't attack the true drivers behind our terrible outcomes: compliance to effective behaviors and vaccination rates. I'm not sure we ever can fix it, but it's very sad that we're not even trying. Equitable care is ignored, as is basic science, like this researcher who thinks he can develop something in 3 to 5 years. Okay, what could the viral evolutions look like? Well, this is where they could come from based on a study, the model risk, Africa. Why? Population density. They don't behave well. There's something called the Oxford Stringency Index that measures behavior. They're not vaccinated. They have a lot of immunocompromised people, HIV, which is where these mutations really breed. These are the common likely realities. If you're unvaccinated, not previously infected, you're at risk. If you're previously infected alone, you're at moderate risk. We'll probably have seasonal patterns. We'll probably have annual vaccines, and long COVID will continue. This is the chart I showed before on what potential vaccine protection might be. We're going to use this chart. Again, the green is my guess. This is not a research guess, my guess of what the vaccines might do. Now, predictions are really tough. Here are two predictions. One in May 2021, peer-reviewed, deadlier variants, unlikely. Well, I guess that one wasn't very good. Well, people are smarter. Let's go to November, peer-reviewed. Well, can't have mutations to increase transmissibility. So predictions are tough. Okay, what could the new variants of concern look like? Well, they have to be more transmissible, otherwise you can't wipe out the old guy. Who knows about severity? Even though it has been diminishing, might pop up, nobody knows. Let's assume there are no new variants of concern. Look at the little chart to the left, and I'm showing potential little BA4, BA5, BO6, really close. So they're close nearby mutations where the vaccines might work very well. Maybe this thing just fades out like the Russian flu did. How about if they're minor new variants of concern, like our alpha, beta, similar to what we've seen with the flu. So they're further away from the sweet spot, but there's still pretty good protection. And we have this antiviral, so not so bad. Uh-oh. What if they're like Omicron? Again, look at the chart on the left, and they're way away from any of the vaccines. Then we have these huge disruptions, 4 to 6 months in the developing country and a year or two in the underdeveloping countries. And oops, look where BA2 is. It's in a different part of the space based on a paper that came out just last week. But there's good cross reinfection protection, and there's similar protections from previous vaccines. So who knows? Okay, I'm actually cautiously optimistic. This is a model from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. They're Washington, very good place. Their models have been pretty darn good. So their model early on is very close to their model 6 weeks later. And look how low that case rate is in the summer, 40% less than the happy 2021 summer. Look at the death rate case, way low. Only 1,000 or so deaths in May. That's a third of the automobile rate. Only 12 forecasted deaths in New Jersey. So that's looking pretty good. So could Omicron just be the big bang that turned COVID-19 into a whimper? That would be great. Even if it doesn't turn into a whimper, could be really good if we don't have this disrupted variant of concern. The booster is effective, the new antivirals stay effective, a good hope. And by the way, this holds for us as long as we act quickly if we get the antivirals. It could be great if the next generation vaccine stamps out the beta coronavirus. And by the way, the mRNA vaccines are being developed against the flu, HIV, cancer. So it really could be great. Caution. I think the reduced mask wearing is premature. I'm worried about that, particularly for us folks. There are going to be lasting impacts of the deaths, long COVID, and this bipartisan bitterness. There has been a new variant of concern every several months. So, who knows? And we have the potential. All those reasons for caution, I think we're going to have a pretty nice summer. Okay. I am done.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So we'll take questions and we'll do our usual hand raising through the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the first hand was up a long time ago, and that's Ron Weinger. I'm sending you an unmute request. Go for it.
That was very interesting. My one complaint is some of those graphs were too small, and with the resolution of my computer screen and my eyesight, they were hard to read. But
I will send a link if you want to look at the PowerPoints.
Okay, but the other question I have is, do you know of any good resource to for information about doing any kind of traveling, such as what hotels, motels to avoid, or what to look for, or anything along the lines that could help make overnight stays in strange accommodations, let's say, safer. Safer. Do you know of anything?
I don't know resources. I have some pretty simple guidance. Are you talking about U.S. or international travel?
U.S., particularly down south, where the vaccination rate is Trump-like as opposed to Biden.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I'll tell you what some friends have done that they found effective. One, they called the the hotel, motel, ask them what they did. They tried to see if the check-in could be done by smartphone so they didn't have to go in and talk to anybody. They brought disinfectants with them, so they would disinfect surfaces. The ones who were particularly cautious brought their own linens and then, aired out the rooms before they went in. So, that's the super cautious. Those people who followed that even in higher times never got infected.
Okay,
Thank you.
because I'm intending to finally do some traveling after 2 years, but my big concern was staying, overnight in motels and hotels.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Next one, Mitch.
Yeah, hey Bob, comprehensive as always. It's like drinking from a fire hose whenever you speak to us.
Good news and bad news.
Yeah. Well, and I'm in awe of what you do in your retirement. My question is, looking at this from a public health perspective, when in early 2020, the SARS-CoV-2 hit us in the United States, and we treated it like a brand new thing, and we didn't use any of the applicable knowledge we had on particulate transmission, viral transmission, PPE effectiveness, and so forth. And it was just like this brand new problem. We had a clean sheet of paper. We had to do something. Well, we now know a whole lot of stuff that we should have known in 2020. What's your guess? Will we retain these lessons learned if we, when the next pandemic hits us in a couple of years, 10 years, whenever? I mean, are we going to actually keep any of this knowledge?
I'm very pessimistic. I think the part that we'll learn is to have good test systems, to get to it on the antivirals, will improve the tracking. The behavior is such a huge component. I remember the one Bush campaign, it's the economy stupid. My line would be, it's the behavior stupid. Unless you get people to wear masks, to socially distance, to get vaccinated, we're going to have the same problem. And with our present political climate and beliefs, I don't see that changing. I wish it would. Sorry.
We can all hope.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tom Pate.
Bob, thank you for a great presentation, as always. There's so much information, it'll take a week for me to digest all of it. But I do have one question related to variants in Africa. With the vaccination rate so low in Africa, isn't it a concern that the variants that will come out of there could significantly affect the rest of the world?
Yeah. One of the charts, probably too busy, said that people's best guess is that's where the next variants will come from. A combination of the vaccination rate and high concerns on the number of HIV patients. There have been several studies on HIV patients to where the nasty mutations that are showing up in the variants have showed up in these patients, when they've been infectious for 8 months, 10 months, 11 months. So that is absolutely a concern. And it's going to take a very long time to get them adequately vaccinated.
Is that because of the infrastructure problems in distributing the vaccine? There was an iconic picture in National Geographic of a person carrying a pack up into somewhere in the mountains of South America to try and vaccinate a little village. And there was nothing in the picture but the guy.
Right. No, it's very sad. It's very hard. I actually military to go in and help. I think that'd be more help than the vaccines.
Thank you, Bob. let me comment on the fire hose syndrome here. This will be turned into a YouTube probably by tomorrow. I'm sure Bob will okay the final one, and so
Sure.
you'll be able to review this on YouTube. And I think you can actually slow it down on replay. And if you have the slides in front of you, there's a good chance that you can pick up some points that flew past you today. So, John Tomaszewski.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Great talk, and I really appreciate the newsletter, The Mouse That Roared, that you send out. I read it quite religiously. My question is on the underreporting. I know I went to a dinner in December with a bunch of guys, and 3 of us came down with it. 2 guys got tested. I did not bother because I had light symptoms. So I'm guessing that Omicron is probably really underreported. What's your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree. There have been guesstimates on the degree of underreporting, and they're all over the place. 2 of my friends who got sick with it early on just tested themselves. Finally, I convinced them to get antivirals. Then they went into the count. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone into the count at all. The estimate on death rate underreporting in Russia, for example, is a factor of 6.5. Worldwide death rate underreporting is a factor of like 3.7. Nobody has any idea what the prevalence is of this thing.
Thank you.
Another comment, Bob. John mentioned your periodic mailing list. You offered to allow our members to join last time you spoke to us last May. Is that offer still open? Are you going to continue to put out these bulletins?
Yeah. I put out updates. I'll tell you what, I'll send Paul a link with 3 links. By email, anybody wants the updates, just let me know.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
And the charts, and also a link to the what would I do if I had COVID. Some people have found that useful.
Excellent. We'll distribute whatever you send. Thank you. Nolan. Oh, here, let me, Nolan, ask you to unmute. Go for it, Nolan.
Thanks for the great talk. Very early, you said 75% of all the viruses in the flu shot we get every year are descended from the 1918 flu. Okay. Thinking long-term, years rather than weeks or months, and you mentioned it at the very end of your talk as well, this could evolve very much like the Russian flu evolved, eventually dying out. And you said you were cautiously optimistic. At the risk of false precision, and I realize probabilities are probabilities, that was my career, is it fair to summarize you as cautiously optimistic, or talk for a minute or two about how your best guesstimate is how this is going to evolve and mutate over time, and whether it will go the direction the 1918 flu went or some other direction? Thank you.
There we go. I have been enjoying with cheerful skepticism paper after paper of people making their guess on what's going to happen. Nobody knows. Okay, I really don't think there is a best guess. Now, my hopeful guess, and I think a reasonable guess, is going to evolve like the 1918 Spanish flu. It's going to be here forever, but it's going to be containable. The big uncertainty, my huge uncertainty on that, is the Omicron specific booster and how effective it is against BA2. Okay, I mean, man, every day, Ann and I were talking, as my wife, Ann and I were talking last night. And she said, have you read anything about the booster? And I said, no, it's driving me nuts.
So Tittle, you're next.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Great talk. A practical question, and it's a guesstimate, but I'm not going to hold you to it. I got some expiring airline miles, and my gut tells me that I'm never going to be able to travel at Christmas time safely. So I'm going to travel in the summer. What do you think of that plan?
Okay. First, I actually think even at reasonable case rates, you can travel safely. Okay. I showed you the way we did it, which is wear N95 masks, not KN95, N95. There is a substantial gain on protection because you get a better fit here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You get a better fit here. KN95 and N95, you get good fit here. You want to fit there. Okay. Wear goggles because the damn thing can enter your eye. And you don't have a drink. You don't eat. You just, you're a mummy. Okay. Traveling this summer, I don't see a problem at all.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Bob, I hope you'll include in your materials a recommendation of what goggles, because I haven't seen much about goggles. We know a lot about masks, but that would be useful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ron Hope.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks again, Bob, for another fantastic discussion. You pointed out the importance of behavior patterns, that there are some that don't get vaccinated because of any one of a number of human behavioral problems. Is there anything being done to get behavioral scientists involved in this issue and trying to develop techniques and strategies to get more people aware of the seriousness and to get them convinced that they should get vaccinated? In a way, it's a little discouraging because I've seen other data recently that indicated, for example, that more Republicans now, the higher percentage of Republicans now, believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And if those people are moving in that direction, is there any hope that the behavior toward vaccinations will ever improve?
Yeah, there were two questions. One, is there any hope? As I said before, I'm pessimistic. Most of the behavior studies that I have read, not all, try to uncover what is behind the hesitancy, most of them. A couple have tried to give people data. Okay, you now are given this data, this data, this data. Did it change your belief? People were very rigid in their views. Minor change, not much. I happen to think the only thing that might make a difference is, we all form cults. Think of the Jones cult, drinking the cyanide. If the cult leaders in both parties advocated the behaviors, and their cult minions advocated behaviors, then I think we'd stand a chance. Until then, I think it's very hard.
Thank you.
Follow up on that point, I wonder how long it's going to take the anti-vax thought leaders on the right to realize that more of their people are dying, and therefore they're going to be losing votes in elections for that reason. And that might change their thinking. So, Mike Martin, you're next.
Yeah, Bob, I have a statistical question about this demarcation between Omicron and Delta. Let me state, as I understand it, diagnostic test, whether in-home or PCR, cannot distinguish between those two viruses. Okay, well, that's at least what the data.
No. I'm sorry. Yes,
they cannot distinguish between those populations.
Right.
So when you assign death to a specific population as being higher with Omicron, my suspicion is that the patients which you are assigning that risk to are in its institutional environment. Now, why am I saying that? Because you can determine Omicron virus in an institutional test, hospital, clinic, through genetic sequencing. That's how you determine whether someone has Omicron. Those precise patients that are in the hospital are probably more sickly than the general population assigned to the Delta virus population. So my question is, assigning death higher to an Omicron virus is at best a guess and at worst speculation. And the reasons for that is there's no real clear demarcation for the ordinary person, whether he has Omicron or Delta. So essentially, we're talking about a blended population of Delta and Omicron patients in which we're assigning some type of death rate to. That's the question.
Okay.
It's a many-folded question.
Oh, no. Good. Okay. You can determine whether somebody has Omicron or Delta from a PCR test. You do not need a genetic sequence. The early PCR tests had something called S negative. There was a spike negative. So if you gave a particular PCR test, you could say, oh, that's Omicron. Okay, so that's point one. It doesn't take the genetic sequencing. Point two, those death statistics came from looking at a time when Delta was predominant, not doing the mixed interval. So you look at the death rate doing the Delta predominant time, a little slice, and then you look at the Omicron predominant slice, a little time, and you compare those relative death rates and hospitalization rates.
So it's historic is what you're saying.
Yeah.
In other words, looking at, but again, I'm not so sure about this PCR test. I've heard different stories of whether it is susceptible, Omicron is susceptible to it, but that's a statistical issue.
BA1 is, BA2 isn't.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Peter Merritt.
I was surprised to read that Hong Kong has amongst the highest COVID deaths in the world now. I would not have expected that because they have, I would have thought, major lockdowns, almost 100% mask usage, and I would think very high vaccination rates. So to what might you attribute the deaths in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I haven't studied Hong Kong in detail recently. I read just a day ago somebody's assessment, which I didn't check, that their problem is due to their low vaccination rate.
Yeah, that seems surprising that they have low vaccination rates then. I would have thought they would have been mandated pretty much to have vaccines, be vaccinated. That surprises me.
Yeah, the other thing that might hurt them, this is my speculation, okay, my speculation. Is there a very crowded population? So once it starts to spread, there are a lot of people nearby. Right, having it spread in North Dakota is a little harder, but that's a guess.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And final question from David Badisher.
Hi, this is, thank you for a very excellent and informative talk. I think it's important of a committee that is responsible for monitoring. This has been going on for over a year for the senior living facility where I live. And we found that in some of the information that you have provided, we have been unable to receive from anywhere else. So thank you for that. So my original question, when I first raised my hand, was, could you send me or, your newsletters, that sort of thing? And if also, if you wouldn't mind, if I would forward them on to some of the other members of my committee.
Sure. No, absolutely. I'm glad you found the information useful. I'm saddened that you don't have better sources.
But he does have Old Guard.
That's right. That's right. That's how I found out about this. I know about this. Thanks.
Exactly.
Bellcore.
That's my
Absolutely.
point. So you can help the rest of those folks at Lantern Hill and spread the news. So at this point, I would like to hand the mic back to Steve Heft.
Okay. Bob, I'm just in awe of the amount of data and the amount of the number of reports that you pull together, whether it's through your analysis, through a meta-analysis, whatever, to try to make sense of the diversity of information that's coming out, instantaneously. And you must not sleep at all to be able to do this. But we thank you for helping bring us up to date. And we want to say thank you in two ways, as we do in the Old Guard. One is through a certificate of appreciation. And as you're well aware, the orchid that's depicted on the lower left is emblematic of the fact that Summit was the orchid center of the East when Old Guard was founded in 1930. And so we say thank you that way. And also, if everyone would unmute, we can say thank you in another way through an Old Guard salute. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, Bob.
Well done.
Thanks again. Back to you, Steve.
you.
Okay, thank you, Steve Heft. And to Bob Martin, what can we say? Your usual tour de force. We are in your debt, sir. And a quick reminder, should you ever tire of all that research and travel with Anne, we would love to have you as an Old Guard member. The only problem would be that probably half a dozen of us would duel for the honor of being your sponsor. But regardless, we understand you occasionally tune in, and please do that whenever you can.
Okay, great. Thank you. And man, even more than you guys hope, I hope we don't have to do another one of these things.
Absolutely. And
we just have to tune in.
you do the heavy lifting.